right, again, you want to roll this away from you. Now this next part is actually quite technical and usually requires a minimum of several hours. Well, we don't have that kind of time, so I'm going to do the process in about 5 minutes. But I do want to stress to you that you will want to beat the fiber longer than we have time for today, and you will want to allow the chemicals to attach to the fiber longer than we have time for today. But it gives you the basics. Color does not adhere to cellulose. You have to use a chemical that attaches to the cellulose. The color then attaches to the chemical. It is called retention agent. It's a cationic resinous compound that's the consistency of a syrup and sticky like honey. In Japanese paper making, because their fibers are very, very long, they use a chemical called neri. It is from the root of the toroeo plant. It is a mucilage. Basically, it's clear slime. It's kind of gross. When you put it in your vat of water, what it does, it allows those long fibers to glide across the surface of the screen as opposed to rolling and knotting like hair. Well, I accidentally found out if you use neri at the same time you use retention agent, it does the exact opposite. It causes those fibers to coagulate and flocculate or clump together, and you can use that to your advantage. So very quickly, I'm going to break down the abaca fiber, cause it to coagulate, and then color it. Now, I'll give you fair warning. It doesn't matter if you have a $7,000 Hollander beater or a $40 blender. If you add too much fiber, you add it too quickly, you will burn it up. And as of this blender right here, I have been very successful. I've burned up 31 of them. So let's go. So I'm going to add the neri. Now that is not the sound you want to hear if you're not using these chemicals. That means you have too much fiber. You need to turn it off, take fiber out, and add more water. But I knew that I was adding the chemicals, so it's fine. Okay, I'm going to let that set for a second. Now the color that I've decided to use is a copper iridescent pigment, which is formulated for paper pulp. In paper making, you cannot use anything that has metal that would cause rust at any time during the paper making process. So for their iridescence, they use what are called mica crystals. This stone right here has mica crystals in them. And actually there's quite a few in here. They break those down into a powder consistency. They add a powdered pigment and it's dispersed in water so that when the sunlight hits the mica crystal, it reflects from one crystal to the other, giving you a glittery iridescence. Now, as I mentioned earlier, paper sinks to the bottom. If you'll notice, this is going to the top, so it's doing exactly what I wanted it to do. Now, I'm going to go ahead and add the color, but you need to be aware when you use a pigment formulated for paper making, in this stage, it does not ever come out of clothing or material. I can't even get it off of the top of this plastic, so you want to be very careful where you use it. Now, every color is different, but with the copper, I should have waited a minimum of 45 minutes to an hour before I put the color on, and another several hours before I use it. Red, black, blue, or purple takes anywhere from 24 to 48 hours to get a good color saturation. The way to tell whether your color has adhered properly in whatever you've beaten it in, when you pick it up, the water is going to run clear, as it is here. Now, we haven't given this one enough time, and the mica crystals are still falling to the bottom, but it's already trying to attach. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in the vat over here, starting to run clear. And I'm going to go ahead and put some of this gold in there. Okay, and you're going to want to just swish it around just a little bit. You try to make sure you don't have any of the color on your hands when you go back into your clean, pristine vat. This will work well if you have a good substrate sheet. So you're going to form your traditional sheet. The reason that they say you cannot double dip in European papermaking is if I were to take the sheet that I just formed, put it back into the vat I formed it in, it would actually bubble and roll off of the screen. It will not allow you to put this back into the vat. If you do it the way that I've shown you, though, you should be able to take your sheet, dip it in with the copper and gold fiber. It will glide across the surface, and as it dries, it will hydrogen bond, becoming one single sheet of paper, where it is cream on one side with the gold and copper on the other. In the United States alone, we consume over 100 million tons of paper a year. The world only produces 300 million tons. We use 100 million tons of it. 1 ton requires approximately 15 to 17 trees. It's equivalent to, I forgot, I'm sorry. It's equivalent to 2.8 million, it uses 2.8 million BTUs of energy and consumes 3 cubic yards of landfill. One Sunday edition requires 70, of the New York Times, requires 70,000 trees times 52 editions. Now, as you'll see, the cream side will not be disturbed, although you may be able to see through the paper because it has a translucency to it at this time. I've now created what is called a post or a pile. Traditionally, you're supposed to have a minimum of 100 sheets of paper with a felt between each sheet before you put it into the press for the first pressing. The first pressing is supposed to stay in for several hours. After several hours, you will release the pressure on the press, you will remove the poster pile, and you will remove all of the felts. You will restack the wet paper one on top of the other without anything between the sheets, and you will put it back into the press, leaving it overnight. You now made what is called a block of paper. The next day, you release this block of 100 sheets of paper and you separate it. If you're doing European style paper making, you would separate this into what are called spurs of 4 to 6 sheets. That is for the purpose of restraint drying. As paper dries, it has a grain and a direction. It buckles up, it shrinks. It's called cockling and curling. By keeping 4 to 6 sheets together, it helps that paper to lay flat. In Japan, for restraint drying, they use what is called a drying board. The grain of the drying board has to be very tight. If it's too loose, the paper will not adhere. Once you find a suitable board, it is to stay outside for 1 full year before you use it. That is because if you'll notice the difference in the color, as paper dries, it leaches the color out of anything it comes into contact with. It would turn your paper brown and ruin it. Now, I didn't have this in overnight, much less 5 minutes. And yet the paper has hydrogen bonded enough to allow me to pick the sheet up. When you brush it onto the drying board, you will brush it in 5 motions only. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Doesn't matter how large or small your sheet is, you just get a larger or smaller brush. The reason is tradition. The other reason is otherwise you have a tendency to rip, tear, bruise, or damage that paper. In Japan, to be allowed to brush it onto a drying board, you must be a master Japanese paper maker. That means you have to have a minimum of 25 years of paper making behind you. They're a little strict. Again, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The side that is brushed against the board is going to be smoother and shinier than the side away from the board. And I have one more thing I'd like to share with you. I went over to a seminar and I was so intrigued with this paper I had to have it. The coloring on this is called suminugashi, which is a Japanese marbling technique, which is water-based. It is not oil-based and it has not faded. I was taught suminugashi at that time. Now this sheet of paper is in excellent condition. It's soft and supple, it's not brittle, it's not falling apart, yet it is over 200 years old. The reason that the paper has lasted is they did not break down the integrity of the fiber by adding whiteners, brighteners, harsh chemicals, and fillers, and they had a very good incentive back then, one we do not have today. As I mentioned, they were a little strict. Back then, the villagers were not allowed to own property. They had to live on property owned by a lord or overseer. Anything you did in that village reflected on his name. So in a paper-making village, if you or any of your family members made poor quality sheets of paper, you were simply put to death. Now, I'm glad I didn't live back then because I would not be here today demonstrating this paper-making. And as I mentioned before, my artwork is directly beside me. You'll see that they're very large pieces. The mold and decal that I use is 34 inches by 44 inches. It is very hard, and this is not an easy job. So I tell everyone it's physically physically hard on your body, but please have a look and see what you can do with paper if you work with it long enough, and you've been a wonderful audience. Thank you.